Hello, um, my name's Rob Haddam and I'm going to be presenting a short presentation called Teachers Working with Funds of Knowledge. I've organised this presentation to be in two parts, so let's start with part one. I'd just like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Gallina people on whom we have been and are custodians of these lands. We acknowledge that the land in which I'm sitting at the moment is the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. My presentation in part one has these moves. I'm trying to introduce the idea of how teachers work with the funds of knowledge approach, but I just needed to provide a bit of a preamble and a rationale for why teachers would be wanting to do that. So I'm wanting to start with trying to discuss very briefly what I see as being the key challenges for public school teachers. And having done that, then it's also important for us to be talking about how we get past deficit views of students and their communities, and in particular working class students and the communities they live in. And for the sake of this presentation, given that I'm presenting in Adelaide, we could talk about the northern, western and southern suburbs of Adelaide, where lots of working class communities live. In getting past deficit, there's many concepts we could use here, but I'm just wanting to introduce very briefly the idea of from some colleagues of mine, Barbara Comer and Barbara Campbell, who invoked the notion of turnaround pedagogy as a way of thinking about how we might do that, which then leads me to wanting to describe what I'm calling a relational view of pedagogy, which I hope is sort of useful here because it picks up on and maps in some ways conceptually what turnaround pedagogy means to me anyway, and then to invoke the notion of working with what our students bring to class, which I'm calling funds of knowledge. Sorry. Now, so the first move then is just looking at the key challenges for public school teachers, and I think there's sort of two types of challenges actually. First of all, we're now working in a policy context that's characterised by national policy failure in education and schooling, and the other type of challenge, of course, is the existential challenges that all teachers struggle with in terms of how they respond to the sort of unique cohort of students at any school. Those challenges, of course, are mostly laminated over by policy that takes a one-size-fits-all approach. Anyway, let's just look at the national policy failure very briefly. The Parliament of Australia website has this to say about where we're up to. So the historic Gonski review identified several highly concerning trends in educational outcomes of Australian students. It found that over the past decade, the performance of Australian students had declined at all levels of achievement compared to international benchmarks. Furthermore, a concerning proportion of Australia's lowest performing students were found not to be meeting minimum standards of achievement. So Australian schooling is going backwards in terms of all of its international benchmarks, in which case we've got sort of falling student achievement nationally. In addition to declining performance, the review found that Australia has a significant gap between its highest and lowest performing students, far greater than many OECD countries. Disturbingly, the review identified an unacceptable link between low levels of achievement and educational disadvantage, particularly among students from low socioeconomic and Indigenous backgrounds. So not only is the country going backwards with student achievement, but we're now one of the most unequal schooling systems in the OECD. Let's bring some of this to bear here. So we've got a low equity system, a persistent achievement gap, systemic inequality that's evident even on the Parliament of Australia website, but clearly is being ignored by policymakers. We've got a persistent appalling outcomes for Indigenous students. We've got flatlining of NAPLAN scores in Australia for the last 5 years at least. Decreasing PISA scores. We've got residualising of public schools and some white flight in Sydney and Melbourne especially. We've also got a crisis for new graduates. There's too many teacher graduates don't make it to 5 years in classrooms, and we've also got a crisis for aspiring leadership across the sector. When I've looked at the sort of main logics of policy in our country, I've come up with these 4 logics. There's a devolution logic that's about 30 or 40 years old. The devolution idea is a very old welfare state keyword, which is now being taken over by a sort of neoliberalism, and we now have a marketized version of it. We've had a shift towards standardizing curriculum and standardizing what it means to be a good teacher and a good leader. This seems to be undermining devolution, of course. We now have policy that just mostly demands compliance. We've had sort of an intensification of parental choice as a policy logic, which has meant the residualising of public schools across Australia, and we now have what Pat Thompson calls cruel accounting, or some form of basic skills testing that's mandated across all jurisdictions, which is quite clearly, I think, eventually, now dumbing down the whole system. When one looks at the evidence about these 4, whether or not they improve student learning, then all the evidence is in the other direction. Now let's just move on to the key challenges for public school teachers. And as I stated a few minutes ago, what are the sort of existential challenges that teachers confront when they walk into classrooms? I think all of us that have been that are teachers struggle with the fact that our teaching doesn't work for all of our students, and this sort of just comes with the territory. We can sort of tease that out a little bit. Too many young people don't find school an engaging or even a safe place to navigate their identity work. And the following ones the following dot points come from teachers I've worked with over the last 15 or 20 years. So many teachers really struggle with getting students to share their ideas in class, or getting them to think for themselves. Many teachers talk about how student participation and engagement with a learning task is a real challenge. There's challenges around parental engagement and how the curriculum could be related to the local community. And of late, in the last decade at least, we can see that many classrooms are now becoming very culturally diverse. And in some cases, there's sort of patchy attendance, and many students are below the sort of NAPLAN standard. Just in terms of super diversity, here's a map of one classroom of a teacher that we've been working with in the western suburbs of Adelaide School, and you can see here that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different languages being spoken in this classroom. Out of a class of about 28, we've got about 18 students that come from different countries. Oh, sorry, we've gone back there. And then when we go and have a look at some sort of demographic of Australia, generally we've got barely half the population is born in Australia. So teachers are now finding themselves in what we could argue is sort of super diverse classrooms, and it's clear to some of us that teachers haven't been provided with the necessary professional development in the last 10 or 20 years to adequately engage with the super diversity. We've got appalling Indigenous student outcomes in our country, which gets taken up in the sort of closing the gap agenda, which mostly seems not to be working very well. Let's now sort of move across to a sort of related theme here. We can see how the students who come from communities that schooling hasn't worked very well for often find themselves at the end of deficit views about those students and about their communities. And there's many things that we said here, but just sort of briefly, I think we live in a society that's awash with deficit views of the least advantaged people. The media promulgates deficit stereotypes daily. People who live in the northern suburbs of Adelaide are particularly at the mercy of television and newspapers with stereotypic representations of what's going on in those communities. Governments for decades engage in blaming the victim policies, and there's too many to mention. Education policy in the last decade pushes a back to basics approach for so-called disadvantaged schools. We can read educational psychology that proposes resilience for poor people. We've got educational anthropology pushing deficit constructions of poor communities, and an educational sociology in the name of trying to make sense of how inequality works, arguing that socioeconomically poor students don't have the right cultural capital to be successful in school. None of these positions are at all helpful for teachers and just promote a self-fulfilling prophecy. It appears to me as though there's sort of two types of deficit views that are promulgated in the schooling sector that teachers are under the influence of. The most common is one that has a long history perpetuating negative stereotypes about young people living in high poverty communities and mostly rendering them incapable of being successful at school, certainly incapable of going on to university. This version of deficit thinking gets to operate as a self-fulfilling prophecy for those who perpetuate its logic. A second and more recent deficit logic, though, is now perpetuated by the policy regime that operates in Australian schools. And in the words of Seller and Lingard, contemporary education policy is characterised by the absent presence of socio-economic context. This is part of a broader policy move in Australia and globally to bracket out or hold constant questions of school and social context in order to focus policy attention on improving and measuring the performance outcomes of students and teachers. And maybe one way to think about this, how this plays out in some school contexts, in the name of not engaging in any deficit talk, one doesn't even name up any socio-economic problems. So we just laminate over the existential issues that present themselves, actually. Put simply, in the name of getting past deficit, let's just ignore the way that inequality works through schooling. Once we ignore the inequality problem, then we can also ignore the reality of disengagement from mainstream approaches to school that is now so evident in disadvantaged schools. Once we ignore that too many young people have good reasons to reject what's on offer, then we can comfortably blame the students for their own failure. Ignoring widespread disengagement also enables policymakers to proclaim unproblematically that more explicit teaching will improve learning outcomes. That seems to be the dominant discourse that now perpetuates schooling in Australia. So for those teachers working in disadvantaged schools, neither of these positions is acceptable. Instead, we need to accept that many students are, to quote from Olsen, wounded by school and hence resist what is on offer. In which case, in too many classrooms, students are in control of the curriculum through a culture of sabotage that produces a stalemate in countless classrooms. And rather than deficit, we can adopt instead an assets-based approach to our students. Against the deficit stereotypes, we can assume that our students bring productive funds of knowledge to their classrooms. Instead, there's an assumption that students are competent and have knowledge, and their life experiences have given them that knowledge. Rejecting deficit discourses here as a starting point, but the real work involves redesigning curriculum and pedagogy that have the potential to turn around school failure or to enact, in Comer and Kamler's words, turnaround pedagogies. Maybe one way to sort of bring this into sharp focus back to the way that we were sort of naming up the challenges for teachers, this appears to me to be a generic challenge that I think is quite sort of generative and productive. The challenge is to provide learning experiences, which we could call curriculum, that are intellectually demanding, along with appropriate pedagogy that supports students to be successful. So perhaps the question here is, how do I set hard things for my students and sustain positive relationships becomes the sort of key challenge for teachers in Australian schools at the moment. just pushing that argument a little bit and borrowing from a very famous paper by Lisa Delpit in 1988, which I think is another way into this problem around setting hard things, but then trying to engage students productively. She argues that students must be taught the codes needed to participate fully in the mainstream of life, not by being forced to attend to hollow, inane, decontextualised sub-skills, i.e. basic skills testing and back to basics approaches, but rather within the context of meaningful communicative endeavours. But they must be allowed the resource of the teacher's expert knowledge whilst being helped to acknowledge their own expertness as well. So there's a sort of a double whammy here. It's not just the teacher doing it to the students, but there's pedagogies that engage in a dialogue with students about what they bring to class. And I've tried to represent this in this diagram using Lusted's definition of pedagogy, which basically argues that pedagogy could be defined as the relationship between students and teachers and knowledge. I guess in classrooms, when we've got a pedagogical encounter going on between teachers and students, it's a very specific encounter, a specific relationship that involves the mediation of knowledge. And we could also argue that what's also being mediated is identity formation. So students are involved in learning, are also involved in constructing their own sort of identities. Teachers are as well, and possibly this even sort of spills over to the sort of action they might take subsequently. We can easily map what the teacher brings to the encounter. All teachers bring their own sort of subject, discipline, vocabulary, an aspiration for deep understanding about the content, a whole set of skills that are related to that subject, understandings, very specific literate and numeracy practices. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in systems though where what the students bring to the encounter is quite often ignored, but we can give some content to that by looking at what life world knowledges do the students bring to class. And this is where we can have language like they bring their own funds of knowledge from their own families and communities. They bring their own understandings of place. They've got their own vernacular literacies that might or might not resonate strongly with how school understands literate practice. They've got their own engagement with popular culture. They're involved in out-of-school learning sites, and so it's not just learning at school. And more recently, we could propose culturally responsive approaches. So, if we're committed to advancing this sort of relational notion of pedagogy, that's attempting to understand what the students bring, then the challenge here is to clarify conceptually and further develop a more dialectical interrelation invoked by Lisa Delpit and one of our colleagues, Lou Zippen, who's making some similar arguments. And here's some questions that we can pose here. How can we provide some clarity around the life world knowledges that young people bring to class? The pedagogical challenges about finding ways to integrate life world and subject discipline knowledges that don't trivialise either. And how do I connect up my discipline knowledge with the knowledges, experiences and aptitudes my students bring to class then become the sort of key challenges. So for me anyway, going back to how do I set hard things and maintain positive relationships with my students? If I'm really struggling with that question, then I find myself really moving into these questions actually. Now, when we go looking for some language and some educational knowledge around these questions, then there's a whole set of concepts that we could work with. In the end, I think what we're talking about is we're talking about getting past highly scripted models of teaching, and we're trying to develop contemporary models of what Garth Boomer called negotiating the curriculum. And we can find resources in the Queensland's Productive Pedagogies framework. There's the Funds of Knowledge approach, which is a very specific approach that's been adopted in many places. There's local literacies, place-based pedagogies, the Multi-Literacies Project, Irish Shore, advanced a notion of situated pedagogy. There's arts-based curriculum, Indigenous perspectives and culturally responsive pedagogies all have some insights around this more dialogic negotiated approach. And that's the end of part one. And please have a go at viewing part two.